The storm had come from nowhere, swallowing the forest whole in a fury of wind and ice that turned the world into a howling void. Elara stumbled through the darkness, her worn boots sinking into mud that pulled at her like grasping hands, her breath coming in sharp gasps that burned her lungs. The cottage was somewhere ahead, a fragile promise of warmth and walls between her and the violence of the night. She'd been gathering firewood when the first drops fell, and now she was paying the price for her stubbornness. Lightning split the darkness, illuminating the twisted shapes of ancient oaks, and in that brief flash she saw it. A shape that didn't belong, dark and still against the base of a tree just beyond the path. Her first instinct was to run. The forest was full of dangers, especially at night. Especially in storms like this, when the boundaries between the human world and the wild thinned to nothing. But something in the way the shape lay, crumpled, motionless, wrong, made her feet slow. Elara had been alone for 3 years now, ever since the fever took her mother and left her with nothing but debt and a roof that leaked when it rained. 3 years of surviving on the edges of the village, of being invisible, forgotten. And in all that time, she'd learned that compassion was a luxury she couldn't afford. But she stopped anyway. The lightning came again, and this time she saw more. The shape was a man, massive, even collapsed as he was. His clothes were soaked through with rain, and something else that glistened black. Blood. The smell that reached her even through the downpour was strange, wild. Like the forest itself had taken human form and bled all over her path. Ilara's hands tightened around the bundle of sticks she still carried, her mind racing through possibilities. A traveler caught by bandits, a soldier from the southern skirmishes, a criminal fleeing justice. Any of those would be reason enough to keep walking, to let the storm finish what it had started. But when the next flash came, she saw his face. Even through the rain and blood and shadows, she could see he was beautiful in a way that shouldn't exist. Sharp features carved from stone, a jaw that could cut glass, dark hair plastered to a skull, too perfectly shaped to be entirely human. Beneath the blood that streaked his temple, there was a quality to his stillness that spoke of sleeping power, of danger barely contained. Elara knew this man was not ordinary. That whatever had brought him here, to her doorstep in the middle of a storm that felt more like a warning than weather, was going to change everything. She should have walked away. Instead, she dropped the firewood and ran toward him. The mud nearly took her down twice, but she caught herself, and then she was kneeling beside him, her fingers reaching for his throat to check for a pulse. His skin was cold, too cold for someone still living, but beneath her fingertips she felt it, the slow, steady beat of a heart that refused to stop. Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by terror. She couldn't leave him here. The storm would kill him. But bringing him inside meant inviting a stranger into the only safe place she had. Elara looked up at the sky and made her choice. Getting him to the cottage was a nightmare of dragging and pulling and half carrying a body that weighed more than any man should. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, and every few feet she had to adjust her grip, her hands slipping on fabric soaked with rain and blood. The storm screamed around them, wind tearing at her hair, lightning turning the world into frozen images. She kicked the door open and dragged him over the threshold, collapsing onto the floor beside him. For a long moment, she just lay there, listening to the storm rage outside. Then she forced herself to move. The cottage was small. One room with a fireplace at one end and a narrow bed at the other. Elara lit the lamp with trembling hands. He was even larger than she'd thought, sprawled across her floor like a fallen god. His body all lean muscle and brutal angles beneath clothes that had once been fine but were now shredded. The blood came from a wound on his side, a deep gash that had soaked through his shirt and pooled beneath him. She grabbed the basin and filled it with water, then tore strips from one of her spare shifts to use as bandages. Her hands moved with competence, peeling away the ruined fabric of his shirt to expose the wound beneath. It was deep, ragged, like something had clawed him open. She worked quickly, cleaning away the blood and dirt, pressing the makeshift bandages against the wound to stem the bleeding. He didn't wake, didn't even flinch, and that scared her more than the injury itself. It was only when she reached for the lamp to bring it closer that she noticed his hand. It lay palm up on the floor, and in the lamplight she could see something that made her breath catch. His nails were dark, not with dirt, but with something else. Something that looked almost like claws retracted beneath human skin. And on his forearm were scars that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental, shapes that might have been writing in a language she didn't know. This was no ordinary traveler. Thunder shook the walls, and somewhere in the darkness outside, something howled. A sound that was neither wolf nor dog, but something in between. Something that made every instinct scream danger. Elara moved to the window and looked out into the storm, but all she could see was rain and wind and thrashing trees. When she turned back, the stranger's eyes were open. They were gold. Not hazel, not brown with amber flecks, but solid. Burning gold that caught the lamplight and threw it back at her like a challenge. He stared at her without blinking, and the intensity of that gaze pinned her in place. His lips moved, shaping a word she couldn't hear, and then his hand shot out, faster than anything human, and caught her wrist in a grip that burned. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, broken with pain, but beneath it was an authority that made her knees want to buckle. And then she felt it, a pull deep in her chest, like an invisible thread connecting her to him had just gone taut. Elara jerked her hand back, but his grip held, fingers wrapped around her wrist like iron bands. Those gold eyes bored into her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. "I asked you a question." His voice was steadier now, stronger, and beneath the roughness she heard command. The kind that expected obedience without question. "Elara." The word came out as barely a whisper. "My name is Elara. You're in my cottage. You were hurt, dying maybe. I brought you inside." She tried to pull away again, but he didn't release her, and the warmth of his touch, because it was warm now, no longer cold but burning hot where his skin met hers, spread up her arm like wildfire. Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. Then it was gone. "You shouldn't have." He released her wrist and tried to sit up, but the movement made him curse under his breath, one hand going to the bandaged wound on his side. Fresh blood seeped through the pale fabric. "Where are my weapons?" "I didn't see any weapons. You had nothing but torn clothes." Elara backed up a step, her freed wrist tingling where he'd touched her. "What attacked you?" But even as she asked, she knew he wouldn't answer. Could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way those impossible eyes tracked her like prey he was deciding whether to hunt. He pushed himself up to sitting, despite the pain, and she watched the muscles in his arms cored beneath skin marked with those strange scars. Up close, she could see they weren't random. They formed patterns, symbols that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "You need to leave," he said, his gaze moving from her to the door. "Now, before they come looking." "Leave? This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." The rest of the words died as he moved, one moment sitting, the next on his feet, swaying but standing, his full height making her tiny cottage feel smaller. He towered over her, broad and dangerous, and the smell of him, that wild, forest smell mixed with something metallic, made her head swim. "You don't understand." He took a step toward her, and she backed up until her shoulders hit the wall beside the hearth. He followed, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I am not safe. Being near me is not safe. Whatever mercy made you drag me out of that storm, forget it. Forget you saw me." But she couldn't forget, would never forget, because that pull in her chest had intensified with his proximity, had become something living and insistent that made her want to reach out and touch him. "Who are you?" she managed to ask. "What are you?" His lips curved into something that might have been a smile if it hadn't looked so bitter. "You already know." And she did, on some level deeper than rational thought. She'd known from the moment she saw him. The stories her mother told weren't just stories. They were warnings, histories. This man was one of them. "Alpha," she whispered, and watched his eyes flash brighter. Watched something like recognition or resignation cross his features. Outside, the storm had begun to quiet, but inside the cottage, the air felt charged, electric. "You're one of the old blood, a shifter." "Yes." The word was torn from him. "And you are human, which means this—" He gestured between them. "This thing you're feeling, this pull, it's a mistake. The bond doesn't choose humans. It can't." But even as he said it, she could see the lie in his eyes, could see the same confusion and horror she felt reflected back at her. "I don't understand." Her hands had curled into fists at her sides. "What bond? I don't even know your name." But she felt it anyway, that invisible thread connecting them, and the wrongness of his denial made her chest burn. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, something crashed against the cottage door hard enough to shake the frame. They both froze. Another impact, then another, accompanied by a snarling growl that raised every hair on her body. "They found me," he said quietly, all color draining from his face. "You need to hide. Now." "Hide where?" Panic clawed up her throat. "What are those things?" Another crash, and this time she heard the wood begin to splinter. Whatever was outside wanted in badly enough to break through, and from the sound, there was more than one. The Alpha moved between her and the door despite his injury, his body a wall of muscle and tension. "Hunters," he said, the word dripping venom. "My brother's pets. They'll kill anything that smells like me. And right now, you." He stopped, his head turning as if scenting the air. When he looked back, his expression had shifted into something savage. "You're covered in my blood. They'll tear you apart." The door exploded inward in a shower of splinters. 3 shapes poured through the opening, too large to be wolves, too twisted to be entirely animal. Their eyes glowed red in the lamplight, teeth like daggers dripping saliva. Elara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the Alpha's roar as he launched himself at the nearest creature. She watched in frozen horror as he collided with the first hunter. His hands, no longer entirely human, now tipped with claws that gleamed black, tearing into fur and flesh. The cottage became a whirlwind of violence, of snarls and wet sounds that turned her stomach. The second hunter circled around, its attention fixed on her, and she scrambled backward, her hand closing around the iron poker beside the hearth. The hunter lunged. Elara swung the poker with every ounce of strength she possessed, felt the impact shudder up her arms as metal connected with bone. The creature yelped and veered sideways, crashing into the table. Before it could recover, the alpha was there, his hand closing around its throat. There was a sickening crack, and the hunter went limp. But the third one had circled behind him. Elara saw it crouch, saw the muscles bunch beneath its mangy fur, and she didn't think, just moved. She threw herself forward, poker raised, and brought it down across the creature's spine as it leaped. Her aim was off, the blow glancing rather than solid, but it was enough to make the hunter twist midair. Its claws raked across her shoulder instead of the alpha's unprotected back, and pain exploded through her in a white-hot burst. She fell. The world tilted sideways, and Elara hit the floor hard, the poker clattering from her grip as pain consumed her shoulder in waves that made her vision blur white at the edges. Distantly, she heard the alpha roar, a sound that wasn't human, that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled her teeth, and then the third hunter's weight was gone, torn away by hands that had become claws. There was a wet, final sound, and then silence broken only by her own ragged breathing, and the storm still raging outside through the destroyed door. "Don't move." His voice came from somewhere above her, rough and strained. She felt his hands on her, gentle despite the blood coating his fingers, turning her just enough to see the damage. 4 parallel gashes ran from her shoulder blade to her collarbone, deep enough that she could feel the wet heat of blood soaking through what remained of her dress. The pain was a living thing now, crawling under her skin, and she bit down on a scream that wanted to escape. "I'm fine," she managed to say, though they both knew it was a lie. Nothing about this was fine. Her cottage was destroyed. 3 dead hunters lay scattered across her floor like broken dolls, and a shifter alpha was pressing makeshift bandages, torn from his own ruined shirt, against wounds that burned like fire. "You need to go. More will come." "Yes." He didn't look at her face, his attention fixed on the wounds with an intensity that felt almost violent. "But not yet. These cuts—" He stopped, his jaw clenching so hard she could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. "These cuts were meant for me. You shouldn't have interfered." "You would have died." The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with a pain that had nothing to do with her shoulder. "That thing was going to tear your throat out." She tried to sit up, but his hand on her uninjured shoulder kept her down, the pressure firm enough to make her aware that arguing would be pointless. "Yes, and you would have been safe." He finally looked at her then, those gold eyes meeting hers with something that might have been anger or frustration or something else entirely. "Do you understand what you've done? The hunters will report back. They'll know a human interfered, that you carry my scent now, not just from blood, but from the bond. You've marked yourself as mine, and my enemies will come for you. I'm not yours." The protest was automatic, defensive, but even as she said it, she felt that pull in her chest tighten, felt the truth of his words settle into her bones like cold water. "I don't even know your name. You can't claim someone you don't know." His lips curved into something too bitter to be a smile. "Kael." The name fell between them like a stone dropped into still water. "My name is Kael, and I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. Or I was, before my brother decided I would be better served dead. He tied off the bandage with movements that were too precise, too controlled, and Elara understood that he was holding himself back from something, violence or grief or both. Alpha King. The words echoed in her head, rearranging everything she thought she understood about the bleeding, wounded stranger she'd dragged from the storm. Kings didn't collapse in forests. Kings didn't nearly die on the floors of peasant cottages. And they certainly didn't look at penniless human girls with expressions that suggested she'd just ruined everything by saving their lives. Your brother. Her throat felt tight. He sent those things? Kael nodded once, sharp and definitive. Marcus has always been ambitious, but ambition requires opportunity, and I provided that when I came north to investigate reports of rogues attacking human settlements. He arranged for the rogues to ambush me, knowing I'd be isolated from my guard. What he didn't account for was my ability to survive long enough to reach shelter. His eyes moved to the ruined door, to the storm beyond. Or perhaps he did, and this was always meant to be a test. A test of what? But she knew, could see it in the way his gaze returned to her, heavy with meaning she didn't want to examine. A test of whether the bond would manifest, whether she would interfere, whether he would allow himself to be saved by someone who, by all rights, shouldn't exist in his world at all. We need to move. Kael stood, and she watched him sway slightly before catching himself against the wall. His wound had reopened during the fight, fresh blood seeping through the bandages she'd applied, and his face had gone pale beneath the dirt and gore. My brother's hunters travel in packs of 5. Those 3 were scouts. The other 2 will return with reinforcements when their companions don't report back. You can barely stand. Elara forced herself upright despite the screaming protest from her shoulder, using the wall for support. You need rest, and clean bandages, and... She looked around her destroyed cottage, at the bodies that would need to be dealt with, at the door hanging off its broken hinges. And we have nothing. No supplies, no weapons, nowhere safe to go. There's a safe house. Kael moved to one of the dead hunters and began searching its body with methodical efficiency. 2 days north, hidden in the mountains. It's warded against tracking magic and stocked with supplies. If we can reach it, we'll have time to plan. He pulled a crude blade from the hunter's belt and tested its weight before tucking it into his own. But we need to leave now, before dawn. 2 days. Elara looked down at her ruined dress, at her bare feet, at the shoulder that was still bleeding sluggishly beneath the bandages. 2 days through mountains in late autumn with a wounded Alpha King and hunters on their trail. It was suicide. She should refuse, should demand he leave and never return, should let him face whatever fate his brother had planned without dragging her into it. But that pull in her chest, that bond he'd spoken of, had other ideas. The thought of him leaving, of walking out that broken door and disappearing into the storm, made something in her want to scream, made her hands shake with the need to reach for him, to keep him close, to tie herself to his side, even knowing it meant destruction. I'll need shoes, she heard herself say, and a cloak. Mine is... She gestured vaguely at the blood-soaked fabric pooled around her shoulders. Ruined. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that carefully maintained mask. You're coming with me. It wasn't a question, but it carried the weight of one, as if he'd expected her to refuse and was now trying to understand why she hadn't. Apparently, I don't have a choice. She met his gaze, refusing to look away even though the intensity of those gold eyes made her want to. You said it yourself. Your enemies will come for me now. So either I stay here and wait to die, or I follow you into the mountains and probably die anyway. At least your option involves boots. They left in the darkest hour before dawn, when the storm had finally exhausted itself, and the forest lay drowned in silence. Elara had salvaged what she could from the ruins of her cottage. Her mother's heavy cloak, patched but warm, a pair of leather boots that were too large but better than nothing, and the small leather satchel that held everything of value she owned, which amounted to 3 copper coins and a rusted needle. Everything else, the furniture her grandfather had built, the quilt her mother had sewn, the clay bowls that had held every meal she'd eaten for 20 years, lay broken beneath the bodies of dead hunters she'd never had the courage to look at closely. Kael had refused her help preparing for the journey, moving with a stiff efficiency that suggested every movement cost him, but he was too proud or too stubborn to admit it. He'd stripped the hunters of anything useful: weapons, dried meat wrapped in oilcloth, a water skin that smelled faintly of something bitter, and distributed the weight between them with a precision that spoke of military training. The blade he'd taken earlier was now strapped to his thigh, and he'd found a second knife among the bodies that he'd offered to her handle, first without a word. She'd taken it. Now they walked in silence through a forest that had never felt more alien. The trees here were ancient, their trunks wider than houses, their canopy so thick that even in daylight only thin streams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor. But it was still night, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the pale luminescence of fungi that grew in clusters along fallen logs, and the distant glow of Kael's eyes when he turned to check that she was still following. That glow unnerved her more than the darkness. It was a constant reminder that he was other, that the man walking ahead of her wasn't entirely a man at all. Her shoulder throbbed with every step, the bandages already soaked through with blood that had dried into a stiff crust against her skin. Kael had checked the wound before they left, his touch impersonal and efficient as he'd rewrapped it with strips torn from one of the hunter's cloaks. "It's deep," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "But clean. It'll scar, but it won't kill you if we keep it from festering." His matter-of-fact tone had somehow made it worse, as if her injury was just another problem to be managed, another complication in whatever nightmare he'd dragged her into. "How far?" Her voice sounded too loud in the suffocating quiet, and she saw his shoulders tense before he answered without turning around. 2 days at normal pace, 3 or 4, given our condition. Which meant he was as hurt as she'd suspected, though he moved like someone who'd long ago learned to function through pain. "We'll rest when the sun rises, not before." "I wasn't asking for rest." The words came out sharper than intended, defensive, and she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, amusement or annoyance. She couldn't tell. "I was asking how long I have to follow you through the dark, like a blind woman trusting a stranger who won't even look at me." That made him stop. He turned slowly, and in the faint light, his eyes were molten gold, burning with something that might have been anger or might have been something else entirely. "You think I want you here?" His voice was low, controlled, but beneath the control, she heard something raw. "You think I chose this? I should have died in that forest. Would have died if you hadn't interfered. And now, you're bound to me, marked with my blood, and every enemy I have will come for you to get to me. So, forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in conversation while we're still close enough to your cottage that the next pack of hunters could track us." The truth of his words settled between them like stones. Elara wanted to argue, wanted to defend her choice to save him, but she couldn't. Because he was right. She'd interfered in something she didn't understand, and now she was paying the price. "Then why bring me?" she asked quietly. "Why not leave me there? Let me face whatever comes and go on alone?" Something flickered across his face, too quick to read. "Because you saved my life," he said finally, "and because the bond—" He stopped, jaw clenching. "Because I can't leave you, even if I wanted to." The admission seemed torn from him, and Elara felt that pull in her chest tighten in response, felt the invisible thread connecting them go taut with recognition. "I don't understand this bond." She took a step toward him and watched him tense, watched his hands curl into fists at his sides, as if he was fighting the urge to reach for her. "You said it doesn't choose humans. So why me? What makes me different?" "I don't know." The words were ground out between clenched teeth. "And I don't want to know. The bond is—" He turned away, running a hand through his hair, in a gesture that spoke of frustration barely contained. "The bond is a complication I can't afford. My brother wants me dead. My kingdom is at war. And now I have a human mate who I can barely keep alive, let alone protect. I don't need your protection." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. The claw marks on her shoulder, the weight of the knife at her belt, the way her hands still shook when she thought about those red eyes and dripping teeth, all of it proved she was in over her head. "I just need to understand." Kael looked at her then, really looked at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "Understanding won't save you," he said softly. "It won't make the hunters stop hunting. It won't make my brother less determined to kill anyone who carries my scent. And it won't change the fact that every moment you spend near me puts you in more danger." He took a step toward her, closing the distance until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "So don't ask me to explain something I've spent my entire life trying to avoid. Just follow me, stay quiet, and maybe we'll both survive long enough for me to figure out what to do with you." The words should have stung, should have made her angry. But instead, all she felt was that pull intensifying, that need to close the last few inches between them and press her palm against his chest just to feel his heartbeat. "And if I don't want to be something you figure out?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "What if I want—" She stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. What did she want? To go back to her cottage? Impossible. To be free of this bond? Maybe. To touch him? "Don't." The word was harsh, almost a growl, and his hand shot out to catch her wrist before she could reach for him. His grip was gentle despite the command in his voice, his thumb resting against her pulse point where her heartbeat thundered. "Don't want things that will get you killed." But he didn't release her, and in the darkness between them, she could feel something building, a tension that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the way his breathing had changed, had become shallow and ragged. And then he dropped her wrist like it had burned him and turned away. "We're wasting time. The hunters will regroup by midday, and I want to be halfway to the mountains before they pick up our trail." He started walking again, faster this time, and Elara had no choice but to follow. Her wrist still tingling where he'd touched her, and her chest aching with something she couldn't name. By the time the sun rose, they had covered enough ground that Elara could no longer see the smoke from her cottage. The forest had changed around them, the ancient oaks giving way to pines that stood like silent watchers, their branches heavy with ice that caught the morning light and turned it into scattered diamonds. Beautiful, if she'd had the energy to appreciate it. But her shoulder was on fire, each step sending fresh waves of pain down her arm, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. Kael hadn't looked back once. He walked ahead of her with that same fluid grace, as if injury and exhaustion were things that happened to other people, and she hated him a little for it. Hated the way he moved through the world like he owned it. Hated the way her body responded to his presence even now, when all she wanted was to collapse. "We'll stop here." His voice broke the silence without warning, and she looked up to find him standing beside a rocky outcrop that formed a natural shelter. "Rest. Eat something." He didn't wait for her agreement, just moved to the entrance and began checking the perimeter with that same methodical efficiency. Elara sank down against the rock, her legs finally giving out, and closed her eyes against the sudden rush of dizziness. The pain in her shoulder had gone from sharp to dull, which she suspected meant bad things, and when she opened her eyes to check the bandages, she saw fresh blood seeping through. "It's getting worse," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. But Kael heard. He was beside her in an instant, his hands already reaching for the bandages. "Let me see." His touch was gentler than she expected, fingers carefully peeling away the soaked fabric, and she bit down on a sound that wanted to escape when the air hit the wound. His jaw clenched. "It's infected. The hunter's claws must have been poisoned." Poisoned. The word fell between them like a death sentence. "How long do I have?" She tried to make the question light, but it came out wrong, edged with fear she couldn't hide. Kael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled something from the pack he'd taken from the hunters, a small vial filled with liquid that looked like oil mixed with shadow. "Drink this." "What is it?" But even as she asked, she knew she would drink it. Had no choice but to trust him, because the alternative was dying slowly in a forest that didn't care whether she lived or not. "Medicine. It'll slow the poison, buy us time to reach the safe house." He uncorked the vial and held it to her lips, one hand supporting the back of her head. "It's going to hurt." He wasn't lying. The liquid burned going down, tasting like copper and ash, and then the pain hit, a white-hot agony that spread from her throat to her chest, to every nerve ending in her body. She screamed, couldn't help it, and felt Kael's arms wrap around her, holding her as she convulsed against him. "I know," he murmured against her hair. "I know." Breathed through it. And somehow, impossibly, she did. Breathed through pain that felt like dying. Breathed through the terror that she might not make it to the next breath. Breathed until the agony faded to something merely unbearable. When she could finally open her eyes, she found herself pressed against his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, and that pull in her chest had intensified to something that felt almost alive. "Why?" The word came out hoarse, broken. "Why are you doing this? You said I was a complication, that I'd get us both killed. So why not just leave me?" She felt him go still, felt the way his breathing changed. "Because you're mine." The words were rough, torn from somewhere deep. "Even if I don't want you to be, even if it's going to destroy everything, you're mine, and I protect what's mine." Something in her chest cracked open at that, some wall she'd built to protect herself from hoping. "I don't want to be owned," but even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. Or at least, not the whole truth, because part of her, some primal, terrifying part, wanted exactly that, wanted to belong to someone who would fight for her, who would hold her through pain, who looked at her like she was something precious, even when he was trying to push her away. Then what do you want? His hand had moved to her hair, fingers threading through the tangled mess, and the gentleness of the gesture made her throat tight. Tell me what you want, Elara, and I'll try to give it to you. She lifted her head to look at him, and the intensity in those gold eyes stole her breath. I want to understand. I want to know why this bond exists. I want. She stopped, because what she wanted was impossible. Wanted him to look at her like this always. Wanted the gentleness without the fear. Wanted to not be something he was trying to resist. You want me? It wasn't a question. His thumb traced her jawline, a touch that burned despite its lightness. Even though you know I'm dangerous, even though being near me has already cost you everything you had, you still want me. She should deny it, should pull away and create distance and remember that this was temporary, that he was a king and she was nothing, that whatever this bond was, it couldn't survive reality. But she didn't. Yes. The word was barely a whisper. God help me, yes. Something flared in his eyes, triumph or horror or both, and then his hand cupped her face and his forehead came to rest against hers. Then we're both damned, he breathed, because I want you too. And wanting you is going to get us killed. The sound of howling cut through the moment like a blade, distant but unmistakable, echoing through the forest from the direction they'd come. Kael's head snapped up, his body going rigid. They've found our trail. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling her up with him despite her protest. We need to move. Now. I can't. Her legs shook beneath her, the medicine still working through her system, and the world tilted dangerously. Kael, I can't run. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw the moment he made his decision. Then I'll carry you. Before she could protest, he'd swept her into his arms, cradling her against his chest. Hold on to me. And as he started running, impossibly fast, moving through the forest like he was part of it, Elara wrapped her arms around his neck and held on, her face buried against his shoulder, and tried not to think about how right it felt to be held by him. How safe, despite everything. The howling grew closer. The mountains rose before them like jagged teeth biting into a sky gone the color of old bruises. Kael had been running for hours, his breathing steady despite the weight of her in his arms, despite the wound in his side that had reopened and bled through his makeshift bandages until his shirt was more red than fabric. Elara had stopped protesting miles ago, her face pressed against his neck, her arms wrapped tight around his shoulders, as if she could anchor him to consciousness through sheer will. Behind them, the howling had grown closer. Not just the two remaining hunters from the original pack, but more. She could hear it in the layered voices, the way the sound echoed and multiplied until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Marcus had sent reinforcements. They were being herded, driven towards something, and the realization sat cold in her gut. Kael! Her voice was hoarse. This is a trap. I know. He didn't slow, his eyes scanning the tree line ahead. The safe house is a day's journey still. We won't make it. The admission hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to speak. There's a ravine ahead, narrow enough to defend. We make our stand there. We'll die there. She wasn't being dramatic, just honest. Two wounded fighters against a pack of hunters bred specifically to kill alphas? The math was brutally simple. There has to be another way. But even as she said it, she knew there wasn't. The forest had thinned around them, the ancient pines giving way to scrub and stone, and ahead, she could see where the ground dropped away into darkness. The ravine. Kael set her down at its edge, with a gentleness that contradicted the violence humming beneath his skin. His eyes had gone full gold now, no white visible, and his hands had started to shift. Claws extending and retracting as if his body couldn't decide whether to hold human form or surrender to the beast beneath. "When they come," he said, not looking at her, "you run. There's a path down into the ravine. Follow it east until you reach the river, then go north. Don't stop. Don't look back." "No." The word was out before she could stop it, sharp and final. "I'm not leaving you." He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. Not anger, but something worse. Resignation, acceptance, the look of someone who'd already decided they were dead. "You don't have a choice. I'm ordering you." "You're not my king." She stepped toward him, closing the distance he'd tried to create. "You're not my alpha. You don't get to order me to abandon you." Her hands found his chest, felt the rapid hammer of his heart beneath her palms. "I didn't save you just to watch you die protecting me." "Then what do you want from me?" The question was torn from him, raw and bleeding. "What do you expect? That I'll let you die beside me? That I'll watch them tear you apart because you're too stubborn to run?" His hands caught her wrists, his grip almost painful. "I can't." His voice broke. "I can't watch you die." The howling cut off abruptly, and the silence that followed was worse. They both froze, listening to the absence of sound, and Elara felt her heart kick against her ribs. "They're here," she whispered. Kael pulled her behind him in one fluid motion, his body a wall between her and the forest. "Stay back," he ordered, and this time she didn't argue. The hunters emerged from the tree line like shadows given form. More than she'd expected, 10, maybe 12, their eyes glowing red in the fading light, and in the center, larger than the rest, stood a figure that made even Kael go rigid. Human-shaped, but wrong. His features too sharp. His movements too fluid. When he smiled, his teeth were all predator. "Brother," the figure said, and his voice was silk over razors, "you've led me on quite the chase." Marcus. It had to be. Elara felt Kael's entire body tense, felt the tremor that ran through him, rage or fear or both. "You came yourself," Kael said, his voice flat. "Didn't trust your pets to finish the job?" Marcus's smile widened. "Oh, they would have. Eventually. But where's the satisfaction in that? I wanted to see your face when you realized you'd lost everything." His eyes shifted to Elara, and she felt stripped bare by that gaze. "And who is this? Your little human savior?" "She's no one." But the lie was obvious, written in the way Kael had positioned himself, in the protective curl of his shoulders. "Let her go. Your fight is with me." Marcus laughed, the sound wrong and hollow. "Let her go? When she smells like you? When the bond mark is half formed on her shoulder?" He took a step forward, and the hunters moved with him. A coordinated pack. "No, brother. She's exactly what I need. Kill you, claim her, and the throne is mine. The bond will transfer. Painfully, I imagine. But she'll survive. And you'll die knowing I own everything you tried to protect." Elara felt the words like a physical blow. Transfer? The bond could be transferred? She looked at Kael and saw the truth in his face. The horror, the fury, the desperate calculation. "Over my corpse!" Kael growled, and the sound wasn't human anymore. His body began to shift, bones cracking and reforming. and Elara stumbled back as the man she'd been holding became something else. Something massive and furred and terrifying. The wolf that stood where Kael had been was easily twice the size of the hunter's, its fur black as midnight, its eyes burning gold. It snarled, and the sound shook the ground beneath her feet. Marcus smiled. As you wish. And then the hunters attacked. Chaos. That was the only word for what followed. Bodies colliding, teeth and claws flashing in the dying light, blood spraying across stone. Elara pressed herself against the ravine wall, the knife clutched in her shaking hand, and watched as Kael tore through hunters like they were made of paper. But there were too many. For every one he killed, 2 more took its place, and she could see him slowing, could see the blood matting his fur. And Marcus just watched, untouched, his smile never wavering. This was what he'd wanted. To watch his brother die slowly, surrounded by enemies, knowing he'd failed. Elara looked down at the knife in her hand, looked at Marcus, looked at the ravine behind her. At the path Kael had told her to take. She could run, should run, would probably die if she stayed. But that pull in her chest, that bond, was screaming at her to move. Not away, toward. She didn't think, just moved. Ran straight at Marcus with the knife raised and fury burning in her veins. His eyes widened in surprise, just for a moment, and then his hand caught her wrist mid-strike. "Stupid girl," he hissed, and then his other hand was at her throat, lifting her off her feet. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. Could only watch as Kael's head snapped toward her as recognition and horror flooded those gold eyes. The world went white, not from light, but from pain so absolute it erased everything else. Thought, fear, even the understanding of where her body ended and the agony began. Marcus's hand was at her throat, lifting her off the ground, and she could feel his claws extending, pressing into her skin hard enough to draw blood. But beneath that, something else was happening. Something that made Marcus's eyes widen, made his grip falter. Heat. It started in her chest where the bond lived, that invisible thread connecting her to Kael, and it spread outward like fire through dry tinder. Her shoulder, the one the hunter had clawed, the one that had been infected and poisoned, began to burn. Not with fever, but with something else. Something that felt like power waking up after centuries of sleep. The scars on her skin, the ones that had been forming patterns she didn't understand, started to glow. Marcus dropped her. She hit the ground hard, gasping for air, but she couldn't stop staring at her shoulder. The scars were silver now. Bright as moonlight, forming symbols that looked exactly like the ones on Kael's forearms. And she understood, with a clarity that felt like remembering something she'd always known, what they were. Bond marks. Not just from being claimed, but from being chosen by something far older than either of them. Impossible. Marcus's voice had lost its silk coating, revealing the fear beneath. You're human. The old blood it can't. He stumbled backward as she stood, and Elara felt her body moving with a grace that wasn't entirely her own. The pain was still there, but distant now, drowned out by whatever was surging through her veins. Behind Marcus, Kael had stopped fighting. The remaining hunters lay broken around him, but he was staring at her with those gold eyes gone wide, his wolf form trembling. She felt his shock through the bond, felt his confusion and something else, recognition, as if he'd been waiting for this without knowing what this was. The old blood doesn't choose humans, Elara said, and her voice sounded wrong to her own ears, layered, harmonized like two people speaking at once. But I'm not entirely human, am I? And as she said it, she knew it was true. Had always been true. The stories her mother told weren't just stories. They were warnings. Histories. Her mother had been marked too, decades ago, before she'd fled to the village and built a life of quiet hiding. Before she'd had a daughter she'd hoped would never manifest. Your dormant bloodline. Marcus looked at her like she was a puzzle he'd failed to solve. A sleeper. I should have smelled it. Should have. He stopped, his expression shifting to something calculating. It doesn't matter. You're newly woken, untrained, weak. You can't stand against me. Maybe he was right. Elara had no idea what she was doing, no understanding of the power humming beneath her skin. But she had one advantage. She had nothing left to lose. Her cottage was destroyed. Her old life was over. And the man she'd bound herself to, the one her soul recognized despite every logical reason not to, was watching her with an intensity that made her feel invincible. Try me. The words came out as challenge, and she saw Marcus's face twist with rage before he moved. He was faster than the hunters, faster than anything human. But somehow, she was ready. Her body reacted without conscious thought, twisting aside as his claws sliced through the space where her throat had been. The knife, the one she'd taken from the hunters, was in her hand, though she didn't remember drawing it, and she brought it up in an arc that caught Marcus across the ribs. He roared, stumbling back, and the wound smoked where the blade had cut him. Silver. The knife must have been silver. She looked at it properly for the first time and saw symbols etched along the blade, twin to the ones now glowing on her skin. A hunter's weapon, made to kill shifters, and she'd been carrying it all along. Kael. His name tore from her throat without conscious decision. The bond, can you feel it? She didn't need his answer. Could feel him in her chest, in her blood, in the way her heartbeat had synchronized with his. I can feel you. I can. She gasped as another surge of power rushed through her, this one bringing images with it. Memories that weren't hers. A woman with her face standing beside a massive black wolf. A ceremony under a full moon. A mark being burned into skin that looked like hers, but belonged to someone else. Her mother. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. Her mother had been marked but never claimed, had fled before the bond could complete. And that incomplete bond, that severed connection, had passed to her daughter like an inheritance waiting to manifest. She wasn't Kael's mate by accident. She was his mate because her bloodline had always been meant to stand beside his. Their grandmothers, their great-grandmothers, going back generations. Two lines meant to join, separated by fear and tragedy and timing, finally coming together. Complete it! Kael's voice rumbled through her mind, not spoken aloud, but transmitted through the bond itself. Let me in. Trust me. And she did. Against all reason, against the terror of what it would mean to fully bind herself to someone who lived in a world of violence and power. She trusted him. She opened that last door in her chest, the one she'd been holding closed without realizing it, and let him in. The bond snapped into place like a lock finding its key. Elara screamed, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sensation of being filled by someone else's presence, of having her soul expand to hold two instead of one. She could feel everything Kael felt, his pain from the wounds, his exhaustion from the fight, his fierce protective rage focused entirely on her, and beneath all that, something so tender it made her want to weep. Love, not the gentle, gradual kind, but the inevitable, all-consuming kind that recognized its match and refused to let go. And then Kael was beside her, his wolf form dissolving back into human shape, naked and bleeding and beautiful. His hand found hers, fingers interlacing, and where their skin touched the bond marks flared bright enough to blind. Together, he said, and she nodded. They turned to face Marcus as one. Marcus's scream cut through the night like breaking glass. He dropped Elara, let her fall to the rocky ground in his shock, and stumbled backward, staring at his hand where she'd bitten him. The wound smoked, silver poison spreading through his veins like lightning beneath skin. "What did you do?" His voice had gone high with panic, with rage, with the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated badly. Elara spat blood, his blood, onto the ground and watched it sizzle where it landed. "I grew up eating from silver plates," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "My mother insisted, said it would protect me from poison. I never understood why until now." She'd been ingesting silver her entire life, building up a tolerance that would kill a normal human but made her blood, her saliva, her very essence toxic to shifters who meant her harm. Her mother's final gift. Kael was beside her in an instant, his hand finding hers, their bond marks flaring in synchronization. She could feel him through the connection now. Not just emotions, but thoughts, intentions, the way his mind worked in perfect complement to hers. "Together," he said again. And this time, when he looked at Marcus, there was something new in his expression. Not just rage, but certainty, hope. Marcus clutched his poisoned hand, his face twisted with fury. "You think this changes anything? You're still outnumbered, still weak, still—" He stopped, his eyes widening as he looked past them. Elara turned and felt her breath catch. From the forest behind them, shapes were emerging. Not hunters, but wolves. Massive, beautiful, their eyes gleaming gold in the darkness. Dozens of them. And at their head was a she-wolf whose silver fur caught the moonlight like captured starlight. The northern pack. Kael breathed, and through their bond, she felt his shock, his confusion. But they were neutral. They refused to take sides in the succession. The silver wolf shifted as she walked, her form flowing from animal to human with a grace that looked like water becoming air. She was beautiful, tall and lean, with hair that matched her wolf form and eyes that burned with intelligence. "We were neutral," she said, her voice carrying across the ravine, "until your brother made the mistake of sending hunters into our territory. Celine." Marcus's voice had lost its silk, revealing only fear beneath. "This doesn't concern you. This is a matter of royal succession." "Pack law?" "Pack law," Celine interrupted, "says that any alpha who uses corrupted hunters forfeits his claim. Those creatures you sent after your brother? They were infected with dark magic, blood magic, the kind that's been forbidden for 3 centuries. She took a step forward, and the wolves behind her growled in unison. "You've broken covenant, Marcus. And that makes this very much my concern." Elara watched the color drain from Marcus's face, watched him realize his trap had become his cage. "I had no choice," he said, and she heard desperation creeping into his voice. He was weak, taking human lovers, ignoring his responsibilities. The kingdom needed strength. The kingdom needed a king who understood that strength isn't measured in brutality. Kael's voice cut through Marcus's excuses like a blade. "You wanted the throne? You could have challenged me openly, honorably, but you chose poison and ambush and dark magic. You chose to become the very thing our father died fighting against. Our father died a fool. Marcus spat the words. Believing in honor, in tradition, in bonds that weakened rather than strengthened. I won't make his mistakes. He raised his good hand, and Elara felt the air shift, felt something dark and oily gather around him. Magic, the wrong kind. The kind that tasted like rot and smelled like burning hair. If I can't have the throne, neither can you. What happened next occurred too fast for conscious thought. Marcus released whatever he'd been gathering, a wave of corrupted power that rolled toward them like a tsunami of shadow. Kael moved to shield her, his body already beginning to shift. But Elara was faster. She stepped in front of him, her hands raised, and felt something in her chest crack open. Not painfully, but like a door that had always been locked, finally finding its key. Light poured from her palms. Not just light, but pure concentrated power that looked like moonlight made solid. It met Marcus's shadow wave, and the two forces collided with a sound like thunder breaking. Elara screamed with the effort of holding it back, felt her bones vibrate with power she didn't understand and couldn't fully control. But she didn't have to control it alone. Kael was there, his hand on her shoulder, his presence in her mind, his power flowing through their bond to join with hers. Together, they pushed back. The shadow wave shattered, fragments of dark magic dissolving like smoke in sunlight. And in the backlash, Marcus was thrown backward, his body hitting the ground hard enough to crack stone. He didn't get up. Elara collapsed, her legs giving out, but Kael caught her. Always catching her, she thought distantly. Always there when she fell. Is he dead? Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Distant and hollow. No. Celine had crossed the distance to stand over Marcus's prone form. But he will face judgment. Pack law demands it. She looked up at Kael, and something passed between them. Recognition, respect, perhaps even approval. You've changed, cousin. You're stronger than you were. Kael's arms tightened around Elara. I had help. Celine's gaze shifted to Elara, assessing, and she felt stripped bare by those ancient eyes. Dormant bloodline, the silver wolf finally said. Old blood from before the separation. Your ancestor was one of us. She crouched down, bringing herself to eye level. Do you know what that means, little one? Elara shook her head, too exhausted for words. It means you're not just his mate, you're his equal, and together, you're going to change everything. The final battle was nothing like Elara had imagined. There was no grand arena, no circle of witnesses, no ceremony to mark the moment that would decide everything. There was only Marcus, cornered and desperate, his corrupted magic pooling around him like blood in water. And there was Kael beside her, their hands joined, the bond between them singing with power that made the air itself shimmer. You think you've won? Marcus's voice was raw, stripped of its earlier confidence. Blood dripped from the corner of his mouth, not from injury, but from the spell he was casting, one that required sacrifice, his own blood. But I've already set everything in motion. The kingdom will burn before I let you claim it. He raised his hands, and the ground beneath them began to crack. Dark light seeping through the fissures like poison. Elara felt Kael tense, felt his instinct to push her behind him, to shield her from whatever was coming. But through their bond, she sent him a different message. Together. Not you protecting me, us protecting each other. She felt his resistance, centuries of instinct telling him to be the shield, and then she felt it break, felt him accept that she was his equal, not his burden. That acceptance flooded through the bond like light through a prism, and their marks flared in response. "Now," she breathed, and they moved as one. Kael's power surged through their connection, ancient, primal, the strength of 1,000 alphas who had come before him. But it wasn't alone. Elara's power rose to meet it, that dormant bloodline finally fully awakened. Her ancestors had been peacekeepers, mediators between the old blood and the new. Their gift was balance, the ability to harmonize opposing forces. And now, joined with Kael through the bond, she understood what they could do, what they were meant to do. Their combined power hit Marcus's darkness like dawn breaking through night, not overwhelming it, but transforming it, pulling the corruption from his magic and leaving only raw power behind. Marcus screamed, not in pain, but in fury, as he felt his carefully crafted spell unravel. "No! You can't! This isn't possible!" But it was, and as the last of his dark magic dissipated, Marcus collapsed to his knees, powerless. Celine was there in an instant, her pack surrounding Marcus before he could attempt anything else. "It's over," she said quietly, and there was something like pity in her ancient eyes as she looked at him. "You could have been great, Marcus. Instead, you'll be remembered as the prince who tried to destroy his own kingdom." Marcus didn't respond. His head bowed in defeat. Elara's legs gave out, the surge of power leaving her hollow and shaking. But Kael caught her, always catching her, and this time, when he held her, there was no hesitation, no pulling back. His arms wrapped around her completely, one hand cupping the back of her head as he pressed her face against his chest. "You were magnificent," he murmured into her hair. "Terrifying and perfect and mine." "Yours," she agreed, the word no longer frightening. And then, because she was brave and reckless and had nothing left to lose, she added, "If you'll have me." She felt him go still, felt his heart skip a beat beneath her ear. "Have you?" His voice was rough with emotion. "Elara, I've been yours since the moment you dragged me from that storm. Since before that, maybe. Since the bond chose us before we were born." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face with a gentleness that contradicted his warrior's body. "But I need you to understand what you're accepting. Being my mate doesn't just mean the bond. It means becoming Luna, ruling beside me, facing every enemy who wants to test us, who thinks you're my weakness. It means giving up any chance at a quiet, safe life." "I never had a quiet life," Elara said, "and safety is an illusion. I learned that the night I chose to save a dying stranger instead of protecting myself." She reached up to cover his hands with hers. "I don't want quiet. I don't want safe. I want you, want this. Whatever comes with it." Something in Kael's expression cracked, that carefully maintained control finally shattering. "Then let me claim you properly," he said, his voice dropping to something almost reverent. "Not because the bond demands it, but because I'm choosing you, because you're choosing me." He glanced at Celine, who nodded once and gestured for her pack to withdraw, giving them privacy. The claiming ritual was simpler than Elara expected. Kael drew a knife, not the hunter's blade she'd carried, but his own, marked with symbols of his bloodline, and made a shallow cut across his palm. Then he offered the blade to her. "Your blood and mine," he said, "mixed and bound, witnessed by the moon and accepted by the pack. This is how my people have sealed bonds for 10,000 years. Elara took the knife with steady hands and mirrored his cut, watching her blood well up bright red against her skin. When they pressed their palms together, the bond marks on their skin flared so bright she had to close her eyes against the light. Heat flooded through her, not painful, but overwhelming. A sensation of being filled and filling simultaneously. She could feel Kael in ways she'd never imagined, not just his emotions, but his thoughts, his memories, his very essence intertwining with hers, until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. And then he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might break. But Elara had faced down hunters and dark magic and her own fear. She wasn't breakable. She kissed him back with everything she had, all the terror and longing and desperate love that had been building since that first night in the storm. And Kael responded, one arm wrapping around her waist to pull her flush against him, while his other hand tangled in her hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the bond between them felt solid, unbreakable, like a bridge that would stand for eternity. Mine, Kael breathed against her lips. Mine, Elara agreed. And you're mine too. Around them, the northern pack howled their approval, the sound rising into the night sky like a song. 3 months had passed since the ravine. 3 months since Marcus had been brought before the Council of Alphas and sentenced to exile. A fate some said was worse than death for a shifter who'd once dreamed of ruling them all. 3 months since Elara had stood before that same council, her hand in Kael's, and been formally recognized as Luna of the Northern Territories. The title still felt strange on her tongue. Luna, Queen, Mate. Words that belonged to someone else, someone born to power instead of poverty. But when she looked at Kael, really looked at him, the way he watched her across the throne room, like she was something precious he still couldn't quite believe was his, those words felt a little more like truth. You're doing it again. His voice broke through her thoughts, warm with amusement. He'd come up beside her without sound, the way he always did. And now his hand found the small of her back. The touch sent familiar heat through her, the bond singing with recognition even after 3 months of being complete. Overthinking. I'm allowed to overthink, she said, leaning into his warmth. I went from having nothing to having everything. It's a lot to process. They stood on the balcony of the northern palace, not the grand castle where Kael had grown up, but the smaller fortress in the mountains where they'd chosen to make their home. Away from politics and scheming nobles, close to the forest where everything had started. Below them, the valley spread out in shades of autumn gold and deep green, their territory, their pack. The people who'd accepted her not because she was born to it, but because she'd proven herself in blood and fire. Because she'd stood beside their king and fought when running would have been easier. You don't regret it? Kael asked quietly. Giving up your old life for this? Elara turned to face him, reaching up to cup his jaw. He leaned into her touch the way he always did now, that careful distance he'd maintained in the beginning gone completely. What old life? The cottage that leaked when it rained? The village that forgot I existed? I had nothing worth keeping, she smiled. Except maybe my mother's cloak. I still miss that. I'll commission you a dozen cloaks. His hand covered hers, pressing it more firmly against his face. 100. Whatever you want. The intensity in his gold eyes made her chest tight. Even now, after everything, he looked at her like she was the only thing in the world worth seeing. I mean it, Elara. Anything you want, it's yours. I don't want things. She stepped closer until they were pressed together from chest to hip, until she could feel his heartbeat against hers. I just want this. You. Us. The life we're building. Her hand moved from his jaw to rest over his heart. That's more than I ever dreamed of having. Something in his expression cracked, that vulnerability he only showed her breaking through. I don't deserve you, he said roughly. Don't deserve how you saved me, how you keep saving me. Good thing I don't care what you deserve. She pulled him down until their foreheads touched, breathing in his scent. Still wild, still forest and power, but familiar now. Home. You're mine, Kael. That's all that matters. She felt him smile against her skin, felt the way his arms tightened around her waist. Possessive, he murmured. I like it. You made me this way. But there was no accusation in it, only truth. The bond had changed them both, made her braver, stronger, more certain of her place in the world, made him gentler, more open, willing to trust in ways he never had before. They balanced each other, completed each other. Speaking of which, she said, pulling back just enough to meet his eyes. Celine sent word. She wants to visit next month. Something about discussing an alliance. Kael groaned. Politics. I hate politics. But his eyes were warm, amused. Fine, we'll host her. But you're handling the negotiations. You're better at it than I am. It was true. In the 3 months since becoming Luna, Elara had discovered she had a talent for diplomacy that surprised everyone, including herself. Maybe it came from years of navigating village politics as the poorest resident. Maybe it was the peacekeeper blood her mother had passed down. Either way, she'd proven invaluable in rebuilding relationships Marcus had fractured with his ambition. Deal. She grinned. But you have to promise to behave during the banquet. No growling at her wolves just because they look at me. His expression turned mock-offended. I don't growl. You absolutely growl. Last week, you nearly started a territorial dispute because one of the southern emissaries complimented my dress. He wasn't complimenting your dress. Kael's voice had gone low, dangerous in the way that made her pulse quicken. He was imagining how to get you out of it. And you could tell that how. I'm alpha, I know. His hands had started wandering, one sliding up her spine while the other gripped her hip. And I don't share. Good. She pressed up on her toes to kiss him, slow and deep, pouring everything she felt into it. Because I don't share either. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Come on. Kael took her hand, lacing their fingers together. There's something I want to show you. He led her through the palace, down corridors she knew by heart now, and out into the courtyard. In the center, builders had been working for weeks on something he'd refused to let her see. Now, as the covering came down, she gasped. It was a garden. Not grand or formal, but wild and beautiful, the kind of garden that might grow around a small cottage in a forest clearing. Filled with the same herbs and flowers her mother had grown, her hands flew to her mouth. Kael. I know you miss it, he said quietly. Your old life, even if it wasn't perfect. So I thought, maybe we could bring a piece of it here. Somewhere you could go when you need to remember. Tears stung her eyes. It's perfect. She turned and threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. You're perfect. Not even close. But he held her back just as tightly, his face buried in her hair. But I'm yours, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. Above them, the first stars began to appear, and in the distance, wolves howled, not in warning, but in joy. The pack celebrating another day of peace, another night of safety. Another tomorrow promised to them by the Alpha King and his Luna who'd defied fate and chosen each other anyway. Elara closed her eyes and breathed in the moment, memorizing it. The warmth of Kael's arms, the smell of earth and growing things from her garden, the bond between them humming with contentment. She'd started this journey with nothing. No family, no home, no future beyond survival. And now she had everything. Not because the bond had chosen her, though it had, but because she'd chosen back. Chosen love over fear. Chosen to fight instead of run. Chosen to believe that a girl from nowhere could stand beside a king and call herself his equal. And she was right.